What if no one ever taught you the most important part of growing older? Not how to stay healthy, not how to stay social, but how to stay whole, even when people start drifting away. Because let's be honest, the older we get, the quieter it becomes. The texts slow down. The invitations stop coming. The people who once felt close feel far. And suddenly you're left wondering, did I do something wrong? Or is this just what aging feels like? But what if the loneliness you feel right now isn't a warning sign? It's a doorway? What if losing friends isn't failure? It's freedom. In this video, we're going to open up what really happens to friendship after 70. The part no one teaches. The part no one warns you about. And most importantly, the part that might just change how you treat your time, your energy, and yourself.
No lecturas.
No fluff. Just real stories, Buddhist wisdom, and quiet truths that hit home. And hey, if you've ever felt tired of pretending you're okay when you're not, if you're ready for something deeper, something honest, subscribe right now. You help this channel grow, and you make space for more people to feel a little less alone. Let's begin. Part 1. Why friendship isn't what you thought after 70. It often starts with something small. You reach for your phone and realize, no one's called in days. The last text you sent got a polite response, maybe even a thumbs up emoji, but it didn't turn into a conversation. You scroll through your contacts, names that once meant something, but tonight, it just feels quiet. Maybe you've been here too. It's not that you don't have friends. You do, or at least you did. People you shared birthdays with, potlucks, laughs in crowded restaurants, long phone calls late at night about nothing and everything. But lately, things have changed. The calls come less often. The invitations trickle down. And sometimes, when you do meet up, the connection just isn't there anymore. First, you might brush it off. People are busy. Everyone's dealing with their own stuff. That's true. But a quiet little question starts to stir beneath the surface. What if friendship at this age doesn't look like it used to? Years ago, I used to think having friends meant being surrounded. The more the better. Game nights, group trips, shared calendars filled with birthdays and anniversaries. Friendship, to me, meant noise. Laughing across the table, teasing each other over silly things, being included in everything. And when that began to fade, I thought something was wrong. I remember a day not too long ago, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of tea, staring at the steam rising. It was the day after my 71st birthday. A few people had sent messages. One neighbor dropped off a card. But there was no gathering, no cake. Just me and the soft hum of the refrigerator. And for a moment, I felt that tight ache. The one that whispers, "You've been forgotten." I kept that ache to myself. Didn't want to burden anyone. But later that week, I met up with an old friend, Helen, at the park. We've known each other since we were 30, raised kids in the same neighborhood, watched each other lose parents, retire, downsize. She's one of the few people I still meet without feeling like I have to explain myself. We sat on a bench in the shade, her hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup. And after some quiet, she said something that stayed with me. I think I'm starting to feel more alone when I'm with people than when I'm by myself. I looked at her, surprised, but then I nodded. I knew exactly what she meant. The conversation moved slow after that. Not awkward slow, gentle slow, like neither of us needed to fill the space with noise. Just being there together was enough. And I realized something that day. I'd been holding on to an old definition of friendship, one shaped by decades of social events, shared goals, and external affirmation. But life after 70, it invites something different. It invites quiet companionship, not constant contact. It asks for depth, not numbers. It honors presence, even in absence. Buddhism has a word for this kind of shift, non-clinging. But I'm not here to give you a teaching. I just want to tell you what it feels like. It feels like finally taking a deep breath and not worrying if anyone else notices. It feels like realizing that some friendships fade not because you did something wrong, but because seasons change. And it's okay to let them. There's a woman I knew from church years ago, Marjorie. She was always the connector, the one organizing luncheons, keeping everyone looped in. But when her husband passed away, she stopped showing up. People noticed. They whispered. "She's isolating," someone said. "She needs us," another offered. One afternoon, I decided to visit her. She lived in a small house with a garden full of wild lavender. She greeted me with a quiet smile, thinner than I remembered, but steady. We sat on her porch with cups of tea, and I asked gently, "Have you been lonely?" She looked at the flowers for a long time before replying. "No," she said. "I've been grieving, and healing, and resting. I didn't know I was allowed to do that without entertaining people." Her words hit me in the chest. How many of us spend years performing our friendships? Afraid to miss a lunch, afraid to seem distant, afraid that if we don't show up, we'll be forgotten or judged. And how many of us have stayed in connections long past their natural life, just because we're afraid of the silence that might follow? But here's the surprising thing. The silence? It's not empty. In fact, sometimes the silence knows you better than anyone else does. I found that the friendships that matter most now are the ones that don't require noise. The ones where we can sit in stillness, say nothing for a while, and when we do speak, it's not to impress or update, but to be real. Not to catch up, but to connect. One friend, Peter, sends me one message every month. Just a simple, "Still thinking of you." That's it. No back and forth. No expectation. Just presence. And you know what? It means more to me than 100 meaningless texts. Another friend, Diane, and I talk once every few months. No guilt. No, "Why didn't you call?" We pick up where we left off every time. And when we hang up, I feel seen, not drained. That's how I know it's real. So if you're sitting with that quiet ache tonight, wondering why the phone hasn't rung, or why you haven't been invited, let me gently ask, what if this isn't rejection? What if it's space being made for something new? Maybe that space isn't meant to be filled with more people, but with more of you, more of your own rhythm, more of your own voice, more of your own peace. I'm not saying you should give up on friendship. Not at all. I'm saying it might be time to let friendship grow into a new shape. One that doesn't demand, doesn't perform, doesn't drain. One that respects the sacredness of this chapter in your life. You're not the same person you were at 40 or even 60, and so it makes sense that your relationships might change too. Let them. Let go of the old idea that friendship means constant presence or perfect understanding. And maybe in that letting go, you'll find something truer, like the way a single bird's song sounds louder at dawn, or how a walk alone in the evening can feel like coming home, or how sitting on your porch with a cup of tea can be enough, more than enough, because the friendship you have with yourself, the way you sit with your own thoughts, the way you honor your own feelings, the way you give yourself space to just be, that's the foundation. Everything else is a blessing, not a requirement. So tonight, if it feels quiet, maybe that's not a problem to solve. Maybe it's a soft invitation to breathe, to rest, to remember who you are without needing anyone else to remind you. Because the truth is, you haven't been left behind. You're just being called inward. And in that space, something beautiful begins. You don't need more friends. You just need more of yourself. If this touched something in you, I'd love to hear it in the comments. I always read every word. Let's keep going. Part 2, the loneliness that disappears when you stop chasing people. It often happens late in the afternoon. The light shifts a little. The house grows still. You glance around the room, and for a moment, something in your chest feels hollow. No one's coming by. No plans. No messages waiting. Just quiet. And maybe you ask yourself, is this what loneliness feels like? I used to think so too. There was a time in my late 60s when I tried to keep busy just to avoid that stillness. I'd fill my days with errands I didn't need to run, visit people who didn't quite feel like home anymore, say yes to every invitation, even if I knew I'd come home more tired than fulfilled. I thought movement was the answer. If I stayed moving, I wouldn't feel alone. But all that motion, it was just noise. There's something no one tells you, the loneliest feeling isn't being alone. It's being with people and still feeling unseen. A few years ago, I went to a holiday dinner I didn't want to go to. It was a neighbors' gathering, nice folks, cheerful decor, wine glasses clinking, everyone chatting about the same things they always did. Vacations, politics, the cost of groceries. I nodded and smiled and joined in like I always had. But halfway through a story I was pretending to enjoy, I caught my reflection in a window, and something about the way I was smiling, it didn't feel like me. I realized in that moment I wasn't really there. I was performing, just going through the motions because I thought that's what you're supposed to do to avoid loneliness. But that evening, as I walked home under a cold sky, I felt more alone than I had in years. That was the night I stopped chasing. Not because I gave up on people, but because I wanted something real. A few weeks later, I started taking walks alone. Not power walks, not get your steps in walks, just slow ones. No destination. Sometimes I'd walk through the park. Sometimes just around the block. I didn't bring my phone. I didn't text to see who might join. It was just me and the sound of leaves under my feet. At first, it was uncomfortable. My thoughts ran wild. I wondered what people would think. Has she become a recluse? Is she okay? The silence felt heavy at first, but something shifted one morning. I was walking past a tree I must have seen 100 times before, but that day I actually saw it. The way the early sun hit its bark, the small bird hopping along one of its branches, the quiet stillness of it all. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Present. That moment didn't need to be shared. It didn't need a caption or a conversation. It was just mine. And that felt like company. Slowly, something opened in me. Not a sudden enlightenment, just a soft realization that the feeling I used to call loneliness wasn't really loneliness. It was disconnection from myself. And when I stopped running from it, when I stopped chasing people to fill it, something unexpected happened. That hollow space softened, started to feel peaceful. I remember talking to a friend, Mark, around that same time. He had recently gone through a divorce, moved to a smaller place, and was struggling with the quiet of his new life. He said to me, "I never thought I'd feel this lonely in a room full of people." I nodded and told him gently, "Maybe the loneliness isn't about who's in the room. Maybe it's about how honest we're allowed to be in it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, I don't think I've been honest with myself in a long time." There it was. So many of us keep reaching for company because we're afraid of what we'll hear in the silence. But the silence doesn't hurt. It heals. If you let it. Buddhism talks about the concept of returning home to yourself. Again, I'm not here to teach you. I'm just here to say, I felt what that means. It's the moment you stop asking people to fill your emptiness and instead start exploring it. It's the moment you stop asking, why haven't they called? And start asking, what am I really missing? Sometimes it's not people we need, it's presence. And that begins with ourselves. There's a quiet kind of friendship that grows when you stop performing for the world. It's not flashy, it's not loud. It's the kind of friendship where you light a candle in the evening just because you want to, where you make a meal for yourself and plate it beautifully. Not because anyone will see it, but because you deserve that kind of care. That kind of companionship, it doesn't come from chasing, it comes from being. Let me tell you one more story. There's a Buddhist nun I met once during a visit to Plum Village years ago. Her name was Sister Thwan. She had lived in silence for nearly 15 years. When I asked her if she ever got lonely, she smiled. Not a forced smile, a soft one, and said, "Only when I forget I'm already enough. I'll never forget that." And over time, I've come to believe it. Because loneliness, the way we feel it after 60 or 70, it's not always about others disappearing. It's often about us not knowing how to be with ourselves. But the good news? That's something we can learn. Start small. Sit in the stillness for 5 minutes without a screen. Make tea and watch the way the steam rises, without needing to fill the time. Walk without your phone and look at the sky. And if, in those moments, the ache returns, that's okay. You're not doing it wrong. You're just remembering. You're remembering how to be here, with yourself. That's not loneliness. That's returning. And when you stop chasing people, when you stop trying to prove you still belong in everyone's lives, you begin to belong to yourself. And from there, the right people stay, the right ones come, the rest fall away, and you no longer need to run after them, because you're already home. The loneliness fades when you stop looking out there for what's only ever been in here. If this spoke to something inside you, I'd love to hear it in the comments. I always read every word. And slowly, another part of the story appears. Part 3, the peace that comes from saying no without guilt. You know that feeling when the phone rings and your stomach tightens? It's not that you don't care. It's not that you don't love them. It's just you're tired. You've had a long day, or maybe no day at all, just a quiet one, finally. And the thought of picking up that call, of being on again, even for a friend, feels like more than you have in you. Still, you answer, or you say yes to the invitation, or you promise to show up, even when your body says no and your heart says please, not today. Sound familiar? I spent years doing that. There was a time, especially in my late 50s and early 60s, when I felt like every no needed a good excuse. I couldn't just decline. I had to explain, justify, soften the blow. I didn't want to be rude. I didn't want anyone thinking I didn't care. So I kept showing up, when I was tired, when I was hurting, when I needed space. But somewhere in my early 70s, that rhythm cracked. I remember it clearly. It was a Sunday. A friend had invited me to a brunch. Nothing fancy, just a small gathering of people I mostly knew. I'd already said yes earlier in the week. But that morning, I woke up feeling fragile. Not sick, not sad, just deeply quiet inside. There was something about the way the light came through the curtains that day. Felt sacred, like the world was whispering, "Stay, be still." But the guilt came fast. "You said you'd go. They'll be disappointed. Don't be difficult." I almost picked up the phone to get dressed and push through. Almost. But then I did something I hadn't done in years. I said no. Not with a grand story. Just a soft, honest message. "I'm sorry. I need today to myself." And then, I waited. For the guilt to flood in. For the judgment. For the regret. But none of it came. What came was relief. I sat on the porch with a book I never finished. I drank my tea while it was still hot. I watched a little bird hop around the edge of the railing. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel fully in years. Peace. Not just the absence of noise, but the presence of permission. The quiet knowing that I could honor what I needed without explanation. From that moment on, I started practicing something that changed everything. The sacred no. Not a no that slams doors. Not a no that burns bridges. Just a gentle no. A no that says, "I care about you, and I'm learning to care about me too." I shared this with a friend of mine, Carol. She's 68 and still runs a little catering business. She's generous to a fault, always bringing people food, never forgetting a birthday. But she came to me one afternoon nearly in tears. She had just come back from a baby shower she didn't want to attend, feeling drained and dismissed. "I don't know why I said yes," she told me. "I just didn't want them to think I was selfish." And I told her what someone once told me. It's not selfish to rest. It's sacred. We sat together on my couch, both of us a little worn out by years of being agreeable. And we made a quiet promise right there and then. We would start saying no, not as a rejection, but as a return. A return to ourselves, to our rhythm, to the parts of us we left behind to make everyone else comfortable. It wasn't easy at first. The first few no's came with heartbeats in the throat. What if they're hurt? What if they never invite me again? But little by little, the fear began to fade. And in its place, clarity. Because here's the truth that no one tells you when you're younger. Not every invitation is meant to be accepted. Not every conversation is yours to carry. Not every group is yours to belong to. And not every expectation is yours to fulfill. When you start saying no from the heart, you make space for a different kind of life. A slower life. A more honest one. You realize you don't need to be everything to everyone. You just need to be real with yourself. One woman I admire deeply is Sister On. a retired schoolteacher who now lives simply by the ocean. She once told me, "Every time I said yes when I meant no, I left a little part of myself behind." Her words hit me like a bell in an empty hall. Because how many of us have done that? How many times have we abandoned our need for stillness, our aching feet, our tired hearts, just to be polite? We tell ourselves it's kindness, but real kindness includes us too. I found that the people who truly love you, who truly see you, don't need you to explain your no. They feel the truth in it, and they love you not just when you show up, but also when you don't. Saying no has given me back time, but more than that, it's given me back trust. In myself, I trust that I know when I need rest. I trust that I'm allowed to listen to that need. And I trust that saying no to others is often a yes to something much deeper. Like watching the sky turn pink at sunset instead of making small talk that empties you. Like falling asleep early with a quiet mind instead of reliving a draining conversation all night. Like breathing fully in your own space, no performance required. So if you're struggling with guilt over the things you no longer have the energy for, let me say this gently. You don't owe anyone your exhaustion. You don't owe anyone your constant presence. You don't have to apologize for choosing peace over pressure. You are not a bad friend for needing rest. You are not selfish for protecting your energy. You are not less lovable for choosing quiet over noise. You are simply human. A human who is learning to return home. A human who is starting to believe that rest is not weakness. It's wisdom. And in that wisdom, a new kind of peace blooms. The kind you don't need to chase. The kind that meets you right where you are. You are allowed to say no without guilt. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to be enough even when you're not available. If this found you at the right moment, I'd love to hear it in the comments. I always read every word. Let's keep going. Part 4, how letting go of people frees your time and mind. It usually begins with something small. You see their name pop up on your phone. Not in a message, but in your contact list while you're looking for someone else. A name you used to tap so often. A name that once lit up your screen regularly. But now it just sits there. You stare at it for a second longer than you mean to. You think, we used to be close. And then the old tug returns, the one that says you should reach out, check in, keep the friendship alive. But your finger hesitates, because deep down you know something's shifted. The calls became one-sided. The conversations started to feel like effort. And now, it's been months, maybe even years. Still, a voice whispers, "Don't let it go." That voice used to run my life. I had this belief, maybe you did too, that relationships once formed must be maintained at all costs. That letting go of a friendship meant failure. That the longer you'd known someone, the more obligated you were to keep them in your life, no matter how things had changed. But what if that's not true? What if the act of letting go isn't abandonment? What if it's a kind of quiet wisdom? I learned this from someone I never expected to teach it. His name was Bill. We met at a community gardening group when I was 66. He was in his late 70s, soft-spoken, always wore the same sun-faded hat. He rarely said much, but one morning, as we were pulling weeds side by side, he said something that stopped me cold. "You know," he began, wiping his hands on his jeans, "I used to think the more people I kept in my life, the more valuable I was." I looked at him. "Yeah," he nodded. "But it turns out, keeping people in your life takes time. And sometimes, time is exactly what you need to keep for yourself." I didn't understand it then, not fully, but over the next few years I began to. There were people I kept calling out of habit, people I sent Christmas cards to, even though we hadn't spoken deeply in years, people I agreed to meet for coffee, even though I left those meetings feeling tired, not uplifted. At first, I thought the fatigue was mine to fix. Be more grateful, I told myself. Friendship takes effort. You're just getting older. But that wasn't it. What I was feeling wasn't aging. It was misalignment. A subtle, growing distance between the life I was living and the energy I was giving away. Letting go didn't happen all at once. It's not like I erased anyone. But slowly I stopped chasing. I stopped forcing connections that no longer fit. I allowed silence to stretch where I used to rush in with noise. And do you know what happened? Nothing broke. No one came banging down my door, demanding explanations. Most people didn't even notice the shift. And the ones who mattered, they were still there, because they weren't held by habit. They were held by something deeper. Letting go gave me something I hadn't realized I was craving. Time. Time I could use to walk slowly in the morning, noticing the way the dew clings to blades of grass. Time to sit with a journal, letting my thoughts spill out without needing to filter or summarize them for anyone else. Time to breathe into the moment instead of rushing to meet someone else's schedule. There's a Buddhist phrase I love. When the mind is empty, the light enters. And that's exactly what it felt like. The more I released connections that no longer served this version of me, the more space I had, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Not just for new people, but for myself. For clarity. For quiet. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes I missed them. Sometimes I'd feel a wave of nostalgia for what we used to have. But nostalgia isn't a command. It's just a memory asking to be honored, not resurrected. And when I truly let go, not with bitterness, but with softness, something remarkable happened. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. I stopped wondering if I'd said the wrong thing. I stopped planning how to reconnect with people who hadn't reached out in years. My mind became lighter, free of the background hum of obligations, free of the shoulds and what-ifs, just free. I remember a moment, about a year after I had quietly stepped away from a few old circles. I was sitting in the park alone, watching a mother and child feed ducks by the water. There was laughter in the air, life, movement, and I realized I wasn't lonely. I was full of my own thoughts, my own breath, my own life. I wasn't trying to be anywhere else. I wasn't worried about missing out. I wasn't regretting anything I'd let go of, because what I had now was presence. You see, letting go of people isn't about isolation. It's about alignment. It's about recognizing who fits your life now, not who used to, not who once did, but now. It's about understanding that your time is no longer infinite, and you get to decide how it's spent. It's about trusting that releasing someone doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care enough about both of you to stop pretending. There's one more story I want to share. An old friend, Clara, had held onto a friendship for over 30 years. She and Lisa had gone through everything together. Childhood milestones, weddings, grief. But in the last decade, the conversations had grown strained. Lisa was often critical, impatient, dismissive. Still, Clara kept reaching out. She said, "We've known each other too long to let go." But one day, after another phone call left her in tears, she sat down, breathed deeply, and made a choice. She wrote Lisa a letter, not to blame, not to end dramatically, just to say, "I love you, but I need space to grow in a different direction." She cried. Then she exhaled. And from that day on, her world began to open. Not because she gained more people, but because she regained herself. So if there's a name sitting heavy in your phone, if there's a person whose presence leaves you more drained than nourished, if you're wondering whether it's okay to stop trying, let me offer this gently. Letting go isn't a failure. It's a gift. It's the gift of time, the gift of clarity, the gift of coming home to yourself. And you're allowed to give yourself that gift, because your time is sacred now. And your peace, it's worth protecting. Part 5. When you become the friend you were always seeking. Some evenings, it would hit me the most. You know the kind. The dishes are done. The sun has dipped below the trees, and you find yourself wandering the house in circles. Not because you forgot something, just because you sit down, you stand up, you wonder if there's someone to call, somewhere to go, something to do that will make this moment feel less hollow. That was me more times than I care to admit. And for a long time, I thought the answer was out there. Another conversation, another lunch date, another friendship that might make the quiet evenings feel less heavy. But here's something I've slowly come to learn. Not all loneliness is about being alone. Sometimes it's about the absence of a certain kind of relationship. The one you have with yourself. That idea used to sound strange to me. I used to believe that self-care meant spa days, meditation apps, or inspirational quotes stuck on the fridge. But it's not that. Not really. Becoming your own friend. It's quieter than that. The sitting with yourself when your thoughts feel loud and not running from them. Is making your morning tea just the way you like it. Not because someone else is watching, but because you're finally learning how to watch yourself with kindness. It's remembering to ask, what do I need right now? And really listening for the answer. I remember a moment when this truth first landed for me. It wasn't dramatic. I wasn't at a retreat or reading a wise book. I was just brushing my teeth. I'd had a hard day. I was feeling sensitive, a little down, and completely unsure why. I looked up at the mirror, and for the first time in a long time, instead of looking through myself, I looked at myself. And I thought, not in a pitying way, but a genuine one, "How are you doing?" Really? Surprised me. I'd never asked myself that with such sincerity. I would have asked a friend that. I had asked friends that many times, but never myself. And in that quiet moment, with toothpaste in the corner of my mouth and tired eyes, I felt a tenderness rise that I hadn't given myself in years. From then on, something shifted. I started checking in with myself the way I used to check in with others. How did that conversation feel? Do you actually want to go to that event? Is this a yes from peace or a yes from guilt? It wasn't some big transformation overnight. There were still days when I forgot. Still moments when I reached for distractions or fell into old habits of seeking comfort from others before I'd even asked myself what I needed. But the more I did it, the more familiar it became. And eventually, something beautiful started to bloom. I began to feel less afraid of being alone. In fact, I began to enjoy it. There was a comfort in my own company I hadn't known was possible. The kind of comfort where I could sit by the window on a rainy morning, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea, and not feel the urge to fill the silence. Just sit, just be, with me. Some people might call that solitude. I call it friendship, because I was no longer trying to escape myself. I was choosing to stay. You see, when we're young, friendship often means company. A ride or die, plus one. Someone to share the good and the bad with. And that's beautiful. But as we grow older, and especially after 60, friendship becomes something softer, deeper. It's less about who shows up at your door, and more about who's already sitting with you when the door closes. And that someone can be you. I've had to learn how to treat myself the way I once treated my closest friends. With patience, with forgiveness, with celebration, small ones like finishing a book or remembering to water the plants. With compassion when I mess up. I stopped talking to myself like a critic. I stopped calling myself too sensitive or lazy or dramatic. I started talking to myself the way I'd speak to someone I loved. It's okay to rest. You did your best today. You don't have to figure it all out right now. First, it felt awkward, like I was pretending. But over time, it started to feel true. Because here's what no one ever told me clearly. You don't need someone else to tell you that you matter. You can tell yourself, and it still counts. Maybe more than ever. And strangely, when you stop desperately seeking connection from outside, you begin to attract the kind of connection that actually feels aligned. Not out of need, but from wholeness. I've noticed that the few friendships I've formed in recent years are different. They're not built on mutual obligation. We don't text every day. We don't need to. There's no scoreboard, no emotional debt. We meet as two people who know how to be with themselves. And in that, we meet in peace, not panic. There's a phrase a Buddhist teacher once shared with me. The most important relationship in your life is the one you have with your breath. I didn't understand it at first. But now, I think it just means this: you're with yourself every single moment of your life. Every inhale, every exhale, every joy, every grief. So the question becomes, how are you treating the person who's always there? Do you rush past her, criticize her, ignore her pain? Or do you sit beside her, like a friend would? Maybe it's time we stop looking for someone to complete us, and start being the person who chooses not to leave ourselves behind anymore. Not when we're tired, not when we're hurting, not when we're unsure, especially then. Because friendship at this age, in this chapter of life, begins here. with how you greet yourself in the morning, with how you forgive yourself in the evening, with how you show up for your own soul when no one else is watching. It's not lonely, it's loyal. And in that loyalty, in that sacred companionship, you start to realize something kind of extraordinary. You've been the friend you were waiting for, all along. Part 6, the joy of solitude in an age that fears it. It's funny how silence feels different at different points in life. When we're younger, it's often something we run from. Too quiet? Turn on the radio. Feeling alone? Call someone. Bored? Scroll. Post. Plan. There's always something, someone, somewhere to fill the space. But somewhere after 60, after the noise has faded, after the children are grown, after the calendar isn't so full anymore, that silence returns. And this time, it doesn't knock. It just walks right in. And if you're like me, it might feel strange at first. Like you've been left behind by the world you helped build. Like everyone else is still out there. Busy, connected, loud. And you're here, in a quiet house, with the clock ticking and the refrigerator humming and your own thoughts for company. I remember the first time I really felt it. I was standing in the kitchen one afternoon, alone, making tea. No TV, no music, just the slow sound of the kettle warming. And I realized I hadn't spoken out loud in hours. For a second, it made me nervous. Is this it? Is this what the rest of my life is going to be like? Quiet? That thought haunted me for days. I started to fill up my time again. Reached out to people I didn't really miss. Watched shows I wasn't really watching. Said yes to things I didn't feel like doing. All just to escape that stillness. Because somewhere deep in my wiring, I'd been taught what many of us were taught. Solitude means something's wrong. Wrong with your social life. Wrong with your personality. Wrong with how you've aged. But is that true? Is being alone the problem? Or is it how we've been taught to feel about it? The shift happened slowly. Started one morning when I woke up and didn't rush. I didn't check anything. I didn't open the blinds right away. I just stayed in bed for a while, listening to the birds, letting the quiet of the room wash over me. And something inside me whispered, "This is enough," caught me off guard. Because for so long, I thought enough only came from doing, from being seen, from being surrounded. But this was just being. And somehow it felt whole. That morning became a new kind of ritual. I started waking up slower, making breakfast without distractions, sitting outside with a blanket, feeling the early chill. I'd watch the sky change colors and think to myself, not about what needed to get done, but simply about how beautiful it all was. Solitude, I began to see, wasn't empty. It was undisturbed. It was mine. And the more I welcomed it, the more it gave back. I started reading again, not just skimming, but really reading, letting the words sink in, letting them stir something quiet in me. I started cooking slowly, enjoying the sound of onions hitting the pan, the rhythm of chopping, the joy of seasoning without rushing. I sat by the window on rainy days with a blanket and nothing else. No plans, no pings, no pressure. And I felt alive, not from activity, but from attention. I tell this to people sometimes, and they look at me like I've given up on life. "You're saying you like being alone?" they ask, brows raised, voices almost concerned. And I smile, because I used to ask that too. But now I answer honestly, no, I'm not alone. I'm with myself. And I finally enjoy the company. There's a peace in solitude that's hard to describe. It doesn't scream. It doesn't dance for you. It just sits beside you like a steady friend, saying nothing, but staying anyway. It's the quiet walk where you notice the trees for the first time in months. It's the moment you cry without needing to explain. It's the hour you spend doing nothing, and somehow feel more rested than a whole night's sleep. There's a teaching in Buddhism that says, silence is the language of the heart. And now that I'm no longer afraid of it, I know exactly what that means. Because when we stop fearing the quiet, we start hearing the truth. The truth that we don't need to always be in conversation to feel connected. The truth that our presence doesn't have to be validated by a room full of people to be real. The truth that joy doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums, softly, in a still room with the scent of tea and sunlight on your face. My friend Joyce, who lives upstate, once told me about how she spends her mornings. She feeds the birds. That's it. She puts out seed, watches them arrive, and just sits. No multitasking, no updates, just her and the birds. I asked her, "Don't you ever get bored?" She smiled. "No, I get still." And then the stillness becomes joy. That sentence stuck with me for weeks, because I realized maybe we're not bored. Maybe we're just under-practiced in being with ourselves. Maybe we were raised in a world that never taught us the beauty of stillness, that never told us solitude wasn't punishment, it was permission. Permission to come back, to what matters, to who we are, to what it feels like when no one's watching, and nothing needs to be performed. So if you've felt yourself shrinking in this quiet season of life, if you've worried that the world has gone on without you, let me gently offer this. You haven't been left behind. You've been invited into a space where you don't have to earn peace, where you don't have to explain your presence, where you don't have to perform to feel worthy. You just have to stay and listen to the soft sound of your own breath, to the whisper of the wind through the trees, to the quiet knowing that rises when you finally stop running. Because in solitude, you don't lose yourself. You find the self you left waiting long ago. And when you do, you'll see what I see now. Solitude isn't a shadow. It's light, a different kind of light, gentle, still, unmoving. But once you feel it, you'll never fear it again. Part 7, letting go of the need to be needed. There's a moment, somewhere in your 70s, when you realize something subtle but deep. People don't need you in the same way they used to. Your phone isn't ringing as much. Your advice isn't being sought as often. You're not the one being called to fix things, solve things, hold things together. And at first, it feels like a kind of grief. You remember all the years you were the center of things. The one who made the plans, remembered the birthdays, filled the fridge, filled the rooms, filled the gaps. You were the glue. And now the silence makes you wonder, was I only valuable when I was being useful? That's what no one talks about when we talk about aging. Not the wrinkles, not the joints, but the slow unraveling of identity that happens when you're no longer the one everyone relies on. I felt it after retirement, after my kids built lives of their own, after the years of caretaking, volunteering, organizing, advising. Quiet settled in like fog, and I didn't quite know who I was without the need to be needed. There were days I'd try to insert myself back into the center, offer help even when it wasn't asked for, try to make myself useful again. But sometimes I'd hear that gentle response, "Thanks, but I've got it." And even though I smiled, something in me would flinch. Not because I wasn't proud, not because I didn't trust them, but because I didn't know how to feel valuable, just as I was. You see, we're taught to measure our worth in what we do for others, how we show up, how we give. And that's a beautiful thing, a noble thing. But no one teaches us how to feel whole when we're no longer being asked to give. It was a Buddhist teacher who first put words to what I'd been feeling. He said, "The deepest offering is presence, not productivity." It struck something in me. Could it be that I didn't have to do anything to still offer something meaningful? Could it be that my simple presence, my attention, my awareness, my stillness could be enough? That thought scared me at first, but it also opened something. Because if I'm not here to serve everyone's needs anymore, maybe I'm here to finally be with my own. I started to shift slowly. Instead of chasing ways to prove my usefulness, I started asking different questions. Not what do they need from me today, but what is life asking me to notice today? And often the answer wasn't dramatic. It was the way the sun hit the edge of the sink in the morning. It was the taste of a perfectly ripe peach in August. It was the small sense of peace that came when I lit a candle and said nothing. There was no applause, no validation, but something inside me began to settle. And eventually I realized I never needed to be needed. I just needed to feel I belonged. Not to a role, not to a title, but to the present moment. One day, while out on a walk, I passed a young mother struggling with her toddler. The child was crying, the stroller was stuck, and the mother looked worn out. For a second, my old instinct kicked in. Step in, help, fix, but I paused, watched, and then I smiled at her. A deep, knowing smile. One that said, "I've been there. You're doing just fine." She looked up. Our eyes met. She smiled back. Tired, grateful, understood. I didn't lift a finger, but something passed between us that felt sacred. And I understood in that moment. Presence can be the most healing thing we offer. We don't have to solve everything anymore. We don't have to run around proving we still have value. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is be quietly rooted in ourselves. To sit in a room and bring calm just by being calm. To hold space for someone without needing to rescue them. To speak fewer words but have each one carry weight. When you're no longer driven by the need to be needed, something beautiful happens. You begin to choose more wisely. You say no without guilt. You help when it's genuine, not when it's performative. You rest when you're tired. You don't push yourself to prove your worth anymore. You trust that it's already there. I think about my friend Harold, now 83, who used to run the local senior group. He was always organizing things, trips, talks, game nights. He loved it, but he also told me it wore him down. "I think I kept doing it," he confessed one day, "because I didn't know who I was without it." And then one day he handed it off. Just let go. No grand exit. No medals. He just said, "It's someone else's turn now." I asked him how it felt. "Strange at first," he said, "but then peaceful. Like I finally got to hear my own thoughts again." He now spends most mornings sitting by the lake near his house. No agenda, no plan, just him, a thermos of coffee, and the ducks. Sometimes I pass him on my walk. We wave, maybe say a few words. Sometimes we don't speak at all. And it's enough. That's the joy of this chapter. You no longer live to prove. You live to be present, to be gentle, to be whole. Even if no one claps, even if no one asks, even if your calendar is blank. Because when you finally let go of the need to be needed, you make space for something even deeper. The joy of simply being here, alive, aware, peace. You become a presence, a quiet strength, a light, not because you're doing anything, but because you've become someone who no longer abandons themselves just to stay needed. And that's what freedom feels like. If this part of the journey echoed something inside you, I'd love to hear it in the comments. I always read every word. Let's take one final breath together in this stillness and gently let it go. So here's what I hope you remember. You're not losing your place in the world. You're finally taking your place within yourself. The people who drifted away, maybe they were never meant to stay, and maybe you don't need them anymore to feel whole. You're not too late. You're just finally listening. And if this touched something in you, if you felt even one moment of, "That's exactly how I feel," leave a comment. I read every single one. And if you want more truth like this, clear, bold, Buddhist, and real, subscribe now. Not just for you, but for someone else who needs to hear this and hasn't yet found it. That one click supports this work and tells the world we need more honesty like this. Let's keep going.